Welcome everyone to the Town of Los Gatos Town Pension and OPEB Trust Oversight Committee. I'm calling the meeting to order, and Ms. Neese, roll call please.
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Syak.
Here.
Councilmember Rennie.
Here.
Vice Mayor Spector.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Jensen.
Here. Before we proceed further, we have a consent item, which is the minutes from our last meeting. Does anyone want to pull that item? Seeing none, is there a motion on the consent calendar? Just raise your hand and unmute. Councilwoman Sayak?
I move to approve the consent item.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by the Vice Mayor. I'm going to call the question. Again, we're going to be doing roll call votes. Vice Mayor?
Yes.
Councilwoman Sayak?
Yes.
Councilman Rennie?
Yes.
And the mayor votes yes, it passes unanimously. Next item is verbal communication. We have not received any verbal communication about something that is not on tonight's agenda. Just for anyone who may be watching, what we've done is put a deadline because we don't have anyone in the council chambers tonight to receive written communications, but we also are accepting communications up till 15 minutes before each meeting, this meeting and the later regular meeting. We did not receive any, so we're going to move on to our substantive item, item number 2, which is a consideration of a modified direction to staff regarding a CalPERS payment. Mr. Andrews, would you give us the staff report?
Thank you, Mayor and council members. On March 3rd, this committee re-examined previous guidance on the timing for making a second direct payment towards the 2015 gain-loss amortization base of our actuarial valuation. At the time, this committee deliberated and also heard some additional information from the Finance Committee, and at the conclusion of the discussion, with concurrence of staff at the time, the committee voted to move and make the second amortization base payoff prior to May 1st in order to take advantage of actuarial savings that would accrue for the fiscal year 1920 year. After staff engaged in more discussions with CalPERS to fully understand how they would account for that payment being made, it became obvious to staff that rather than getting what would be referred to as kind of a market exposure from when we give them assets, they would actually instead use a methodology that would basically give us a prorated proportion of whatever the investment gain and loss is for the closeout of this fiscal year. And so rather than receiving a unique market exposure, which was one of staff's reasonings for giving the recommendation, we would receive the same market exposure that we did when we made our first payment in October. And based on that discussion, staff is now recommending that we delay making any additional payment until after July 1st. That concludes the staff report, and we're available for any questions.
And council, what I'm going to do, and this is going to be true of this regular meeting as well, to acknowledge those communications that we have received and make that basically be our public portion of the hearing and then move to council questions. So on this matter, we did receive a written communication earlier that's part of our record from Jack Van Ada and Phil Keown regarding the recommendation from staff. And Mr. Andrews, I'm going to ask you to respond to what's contained in that communication, if you would.
Thank you, Mayor and council members. If you'll indulge me, I'm going to try and share my screen. I created a brief illustration that I think might help not only speak to that communication, but then help kind of frame why that communication is only part of the whole actuarial and pension puzzle. Perfect. If the council members will indulge me for a second. So the communication we received is correct in one component, which is when we do make additional payments, we do receive a actuarial budgetary savings based on the payment that's made. But what I don't think is fully appreciated by the authors is the fact that when we do make an additional payment, it's not as if we're actually reducing our liabilities.
I'm going to ask the council members, do you see
I don't think you'll see it.
Mr. Andrews' screen? Ms. Sayak, I do see you. You do not see it. Okay. So we'll try again.
It says it's shared.
And again, Councilwoman Sayak, I see you. Do you see Mr. Andrews' screen? Yes. Okay, thank you. So Mr. Andrews, you want to start over again?
Thank you, council members. So I think one of the components that's kind of missed is what actually happens when we make an additional discretionary payment to CalPERS. And so this slide just kind of shows, what it entails when we talk about our unfunded actuarial liability. And so in a very simplistic example, you can see if we have $40 million of actuarial liabilities, and if we have $30 million of current assets, then that means we have a $10 million unfunded actuarial liability. So if the council members see the next slide I just put up, when we provide additional payments to CalPERS, in this illustration, let's assume we provide them another $3 million in an ADP, those assets actually get credited to the asset column. It's not a reduction of the liability column. The liability column stays at 40 million. Current assets go up to 33 million, and therefore we have a reduced unfunded actuarial liability down to 7 million. So just to reiterate, the result is a lower UAL, but it's important to note that the liabilities have remained the same. And if our council members are able to see the next slide, so therefore the town actually lowers its UAL by providing CalPERS with assets. And so when the town provides CalPERS with assets, what does that really mean? What it means is they put that into an asset allocation that has a diverse amount of exposures with market risk associated with those exposures. And so once again, when we do an ADP, what we're actually doing is providing more assets, which lowers our unfunded liability, but then does expose us to the market risk associated with the asset allocation. So the author is correct. ADPs do provide an actuarial budget savings. The actuarial budget savings does have the potential, though, to be offset by possible investment losses. And in addition, if we do an additional ADP in the current year, with the methodology that CalPERS uses, we will not get a differentiated applied because we did the October one. And so this will result in 8.4 million of ADPs with the same exposure, market exposure in the current year. And so that's why staff is recommending that we defer payment to the following year so that we do get a unique market exposure, but totally appreciating that it does forego the potential for actuarial budget savings, but staff has done a little bit of preliminary work, and we think that the savings would be offset by current losses experienced by CalPERS. And with that, I'm available for any questions again, and I'll take this off the screen.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. And again, I'm going to do a roll call. Vice Mayor, do you have any questions?
Who?
Vice Mayor Spector, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. And I didn't hear you that time. For Mr. Andrews, we received a communication that indicated that if we follow staff's recommendation, we would have a risk of $280,000. And so, is that accurate? Is it not accurate?
So I would say it's partially accurate, Vice Mayor, in the sense that theoretically, if we were to give the ADP prior to May 1st, there would be an actuarial budgetary savings. The complication is, I don't know if it's fully appreciated that when we do give that ADP, we're actually giving it to the asset column and not a reduction to the liability column, and therefore those assets are going to receive a proportionate share of the investment loss for this year. Staff has done some internal work, and we believe that CalPERS in anywhere in the vicinity of down 3% to 5% on the year would completely eliminate the savings that the author is talking about. And I would also like to reiterate, it also doesn't take into account that instead of getting two unique market exposures, we would have one single market exposure of 8.4 million in the current year.
Are you making any assumptions as to whether or not the asset valuation will go up next year?
No, actually, we're trying to be agnostic to any type of market timing, but what we are trying to do, and staff has talked in the past about trying to get, and it's kind of a term used more in personal finance, but the idea of dollar cost averaging, making sure that as we give additional assets to CalPERS, that we get different kind of unique exposures to the market as opposed to one single exposure for all the assets that this council has diligently put together to provide ADPs to CalPERS.
And if I recall correctly, we wanted to pay off a 2015 indebtedness. I may be using the wrong terminology. Is that accurate? And if so, what is the ramification of doing or not doing that?
That is correct. With the help of Bartel, our actuary, we had identified 2015 amortization base to be the next base we would pay. By not paying it, it simply means the actuarial valuations that we will receive, similar to the ones we received last year, will not reflect them receiving additional assets. However, the $4.7 million that we provided in October, that will be reflected in the new actuarial valuation, and so there will also be savings associated with that. Staff's recommendation means that we would just defer any additional actuarial savings to the next fiscal year, and in doing so, we would also receive a unique market exposure different from the market exposure we received in October when we sent $4.7 million.
That's it for now.
Thank you. Councilwoman Sayoc, questions?
Yes, thank you. And Mr. Andrews, I appreciate you're trying to simplify this for us. In terms of dollars, if I understand the public comment correctly, if we were to pay off, if we were to give this lump sum as we had originally intended, we could have a potential of savings of $280. Do we have any indication what, it sounds like we're guessing what that payment, what the potential savings will be if we don't. Is that correct? Like, what are the known amounts and what are we trying to forecast in the future?
Thank you, and it's a good question because there are several variables here. So the authors have identified one variable which standalone is correct, that if you give additional assets to CalPERS, you do get some type of budgetary savings associated with that. However, the investment return assumption is by far a much larger return assumption in actuarial valuations. And currently, CalPERS' actuarial investment return assumption is 7%. At one point on the year this year, they were up 6%. At the end of March 31st, they were down 4%, and currently they're about even to down 1%. Now, granted, there's still 2 months left, but however, all the economic indicators are showing that this may not be what folks refer to as a V-shaped recession, that this might actually be something that permeates through the economy a little longer. And so from a staff perspective, we think it's safe to assume that they're not going to, at a minimum, meet their 7% return objective. And so to the extent that they don't meet that objective and they're down on the year, then any of the theoretical actuarial budgetary savings will be offset by the other actuarial variable of not meeting their investment return. I think another thing that might be helpful is oftentimes we talk about the fact that the 7% is some type of interest savings on debt. Earlier, when I had the slide up that showed a column of 40 million in liabilities and 30 million in assets, and it showed an unfunded liability of 10 million, what that 7% interest payment actually reflects is it's the investment rate of return attributed to the assets that we don't have. It's the investment rate of return to the deficient assets of 10 million, the unfunded liability. And so that's why I think people, assume in any type of traditional debt scenario that if you pay the debt, the debt goes down and the interest goes away. What CalPERS actually does is take the investment rate of return that the assets were supposed to earn, they see that we're deficient in assets, and they charge us the investment rate of return of 7% for that asset deficiency. And so that's why you can't look at the potential budget savings independent of the market risk that the council would be assuming when they give more assets to CalPERS.
Okay, and then if I may, Mayor, one more.
Yes.
And again, I'm trying to simplify this just for my own benefit, Mr. Andrews. So if I'm looking at, we have two options ahead of us, in front of us. The pros of moving forward with your recommendation is that it provides us two different market exposures with an assumption that the second market exposure will be more positive for the town. And that cost savings will help offset the 280 that we may be getting. Yeah? Is that correct?
It is. I would just caveat one thing. What we do know is if we do the payment this year, there's a very high probability that we will not achieve the savings. Staff isn't necessarily saying that we're definitely going to guarantee the savings don't get overwhelmed by investment returns next year either. But what we do know with a pretty good amount of certainty is we probably won't achieve what we think will be a savings this year. And so we would like to get the unique market exposure next year and through that opportunity, the potential to maybe get the savings that we're hoping to achieve with giving CalPERS additional assets.
So then if I'm looking at my pros and cons column or my known versus unknown, what we do know is that but with your recommendation, we get two separate market exposures. We're looking at economic forecasting that is hopeful that the second market exposure will kind of soften and be more beneficial to the town, and that the other known is that we're just giving more assets. We're not necessarily reducing our liability. This is not a traditional debt, a personal debt, where if I continue to pay down the lump sum, that interest rate goes down. So did I correctly summarize my understanding?
I would say that's a fair summary. Thank you, Council Member.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Rennie, any questions?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So I'm just trying to understand, so is CalPERS saying that we can only have one market exposure per year, and since we made a deposit in October, any other deposits we make will be at that same time? Or what is the market exposure we get at what point in time?
So what CalPERS is saying is, other than getting some type of mark to market like you would expect if you were purchasing a mutual fund, where you would get your exposure to the market on that day that you purchased it, we can make multiple payments in a given year, but CalPERS is going to give us a proportionate share of whatever the investment gain and loss is for that year for the time period when we gave them the assets. So for instance, we made a payment in October, which is roughly 9/12 of the current year. So that payment is going to receive 9/12 of whatever the investment gain and loss is for this year, and right now it's looking like an investment loss. If we were to do another payment with about 2 months left, we would receive then 2/12 of whatever the gain or loss is, and right now it's looking like a loss. So what we will have done is given assets twice in a year where we know it's going to be attributed with market losses. And so that's why it seems as with their methodology, the only way we get another unique exposure is to straddle the fiscal year and do it after July 1st.
Second question, which may complicate things in people's minds, but I'll ask it anyway. So since we're talking about an investment loss, not even a break even, the assumption has been they would make 7%, but since we're not making 7%, we're making 0 or less, our unfunded liability is going to grow this year, correct?
Correct, regardless of if we did the ADP in October or if we do an additional ADP now prior to May 1st, it is looking like a very high probability that we will have increased UAL costs with the next valuation. Now, because there's a 2-year lag in valuations, that won't actually have a budget impact for 2 years, but from an actuarial perspective, once we have, it would actually be a new amortization base if you want to think of it that way. The same way we're talking about paying off the 2015 amortization loss base, we will now have a new 2019-2020 amortization base with a loss. So it'll just, one would come off and another one would come on, which is how they offset each other.
Okay, I think that's all my questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member.
I was just going to ask people to raise their hands, but I'll go in the same order I did before. So, Ms. Spector?
Thank you. I want to follow up on what Ms. Sayak was talking about, or at least my version of it. We have evidence, or we have input about a $280,000 benefit to the town. If I understand you correctly, Mr. Andrews, you're saying that may or may not occur. Is that correct?
That's correct. So one of the variables in the actuarial valuation will be the fact that we gave more assets, and those assets could yield $280,000 in budgetary savings. However, if CalPERS misses their investment return and is somewhere in the vicinity of down 3%, that additional actuarial variable will erase the other potential savings from the addition of assets, because those assets will no longer be worth $3 million. They'll be worth something less because of a market decline.
So we don't know if we don't know if we'll get a benefit. We don't know if that benefit will be $280,000. But if we wait, as you're suggesting, until next year, we don't know what that will entail.
That is correct. Staff is not opining on what may or may not occur next year, other than we do know we will get an exposure different from the one this year, and that exposure, whether it's an investment gain or investment loss, will at least be unique and different from this year, as opposed to investing in a time period where there's already a high probability that that investment will be associated with a loss being allocated to it.
So the staff is not giving us an opinion as to whether the $280,000, if we'll have that benefit, but definitely can't give us an opinion as to what would happen if we delay until the next fiscal year.
I would say staff is fairly confident that based on the current CalPERS returns, we will not receive in net the total $280,000 benefit associated with giving the additional payment. Staff is saying that if we do wait to the following year, at least we will get a unique exposure from the one we currently have this year, but we're not indicating whether or not that would be a positive or a negative exposure, just it would at least be a unique, different exposure.
All right, thank you.
Councilwoman Sayak?
Okay, so Mr. Andrews, so again, in my simplistic terms, we're trying to diversify our exposure. Is that just like, you know, when you have stocks, you want to diversify your portfolio, we want to diversify our exposure. Is that my understanding? That's
exactly correct. That's why staff, because of these conversations with CalPERS, retracted our prior recommendation and is now providing this new recommendation to make sure we get that type of diversity, because you know, these are not small amounts of money that council has committed to reducing our unfunded liabilities. We currently have an exposure this year from October of $4.7 million, and now we're discussing, you know, the potential of another almost $3.7 million. And so we are trying to achieve that diversity.
Okay, and if I can, 2 more questions. When we're talking about some hypotheticals, when do we actually get the actuarial bill or the CalPERS bill from telling us how much we need to pay in interest? Or is this something that just is constantly moving?
So every year we basically get a new forecast. And so when we develop the budget, we use the forecast from CalPERS based on the prior evaluation. And so every year we receive a new valuation, but there is a lag. And so staff uses that valuation. However, CalPERS has developed a tool that also gives staff the ability to be forward-looking. But in terms of, actual savings, those savings would be associated with the actual new valuation.
Okay, so there's no tool where we could just do these hypotheticals of if I pay now, this is what it looks like. If I pay later, this is what it looks like.
Correct. The one thing staff is capable of doing is coming to a ballpark range of where we know an investment loss will offset these potential gains. And as we've mentioned, that's somewhere in the, let's say, down 3% on the year. In the next actuarial period, so let's say we were to postpone the payment to the following year. So when they put together the 2019 actuarial valuation, they will give us credit for the 4.7 million. That will have savings associated with it, but it will also have a year in which we have a high probability that it will be associated with a loss. If we were to do the other payment in the following fiscal year, at the end of next June 30th, 2021, when they do another actuarial valuation, they will give us credit for those monies, and then they will attribute whatever the investment gain and loss is for that year.
Okay, and then my second question is, we've spent a lot of time identifying the 2015, I don't even know what you call it, but that line item. If we were to just pay that off, does it in any way help us?
So what it does is, working with Bartel, is it kind of helps us identify dollar amounts of assets that would be good to contribute. And once again, let's try and keep it in that framework that what we're doing is providing more assets. But in doing so, we can say to CalPERS, because one of the things this committee discussed was, well, if we're going to give additional monies, what do we want those monies to do? Do we want those monies to give us the most immediate short-term budgetary relief? Or are we trying to get as much long-term interest rate savings, and once again, the interest associated with the deficient assets? And this committee decided that you wanted to kind of balance it a little. We know our payments are going up from a budget perspective over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. So you wanted to achieve a little bit of relief there, but at the same time, you wanted to make sure that you were getting as much interest savings as you could accomplish. And so in working with Bartel, that's why we picked a 2016 and a 2015, because they provided a little bit of budgetary relief, which is the 280,000 we're talking about currently, if that were to remain. But then you also get the longer term, interest rate savings, where you actually take your entire payment curve and shift it down. And so that's why we chose those two. So there's two benefits. There's the potential of short-term budgetary savings, but then there's the longer term interest rate savings.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Vice Mayor?
Thank you. Is part of staff's recommendation include not paying off the 2015 indebtedness, or whatever the word is?
Actually, no. If council determines that they were going to defer the payment to after July 1st, we would still target that amortization base. We would just be doing it later in time as opposed to paying it before May 1st. But we would still target that same amortization base, because it gives you that kind of balance of a little bit of budgetary savings in the next valuation report, but then also significant interest savings over the long term.
And you're saying that there's a delay between the time that CalPERS analyzes Los Gatos indebtedness and the time that they give us that information. Is it a 1-year lag or a 2-year lag?
So they do the actuarial valuations every year, but it's an actual about 2-year lag before it hits us budgetarily. And so, for instance, let's just assume we did no ADPs this year. At the conclusion of this year, and let's assume it's an investment loss, the increase in UAL relative to the previous budget the town had would not show an impact until about 22, 23.
Okay. And hopefully this is my one last question. What I'm struggling with here is the work that had been done before by Mr. Martell, by the council, by the finance committee to come up with the payment schedule that we have. And while I am certainly aware of the fact that the economy is different and the investments are different, I just can't put my arms around the benefit to wait as opposed to making the payment this fiscal year.
And I think for staff, the new information is understanding in detail now how CalPERS will actually attribute that next payment, as opposed to us getting a unique market exposure. We are guaranteed a proportion of whatever the investment gain and loss is, and currently all indications are it'll be an investment loss. And so we would knowingly be giving additional assets to CalPERS that we're going to get a proportional rate of whatever that loss is. And I think for staff, that's why we brought this recommendation forward, because that's a very different dynamic than what we've discussed in the past.
But we could very well have an investment loss in the next fiscal year.
That is true, but you'll be starting at a different point in time, which means you'll be absorbing a loss at lower market valuations as opposed to basically absorbing the same loss this year.
Thank you, and thank you, Mayor.
Okay, I have a question before I throw it back to the rest of the council. Mr. Andrews, I'm just going to try to summarize my understanding, and I'm like right up against the microphone, Ms. Spector. We are not changing the target for the payment. It is still the 2015 amortization base. We are not changing the amount of the payment. We are simply changing the time that the payment is made. And the reason being that right now, any payment made would be attributed to the current market conditions. Although we can't predict the market conditions when we enter the market later, we can hope at least we have different exposures and different conditions in the market, whereas if we paid now, we are certain of what the conditions are and we're expecting a loss. Is that right?
I would say that's correct. If we were to make another investment now, we know we're going to get an exposure very similar to the October payment we made of $4.7 million. So staff is really just talking about pushing this out in time, not changing the strategy at all, but just pushing it out in time. And we will still get some type of budgetary savings attributed to us in the next fiscal year. We will not know until that year unfolds whether or not an investment gain or loss will also be attributed with that. But we're basically, to your point, just saying, let's defer till after July 1st.
And the reason being that we are as certain as we can be that we will experience a loss in the current market, and CalPERS is telling us that anything we put in is going to be attributed to this current market, whereas if we wait, we have an opportunity to at least have a different exposure in different market conditions. Is that hence the reason for the recommendation?
I don't want to speak for CalPERS, but I would say it's fair to say that when we had these conversations, part of it was them also wanting to make sure that we fully appreciated what was going to happen, and they were giving us a little bit of cautionary advice. They did not want us to make an additional payment unless we fully comprehended how the methodology was going to apportion that new payment.
Okay. Thank you. Councilwoman Sack, did you still have a question?
Yes, just to follow up on that. And so really, it's more information that CalPERS has provided to our staff. It's not a change in CalPERS operations. Is that correct?
No, so CalPERS has had this methodology, but it wasn't until we really started pushing them on how will an additional payment be attributed that they started to really in-depth explain how their methodology works. And it was during that conversation that they also wanted to make sure we fully appreciated that if we were going to make a second payment, that it would receive a proportionate allocation of whatever the investment gain and loss is this year.
Thank you.
Other questions? Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Andrews, this made me wonder. So this payment tranche that we're talking about paying off, it is paid down slowly each year with our additional payments that they what's the right term? The required additional payments that they charge us over the ones that are just the normal. So it is slowly getting paid down. Is it adjusted? So what's left in that tranche, is it adjusted each year? In other words, if we go over the year mark, will it be a lower number that we're paying down?
It probably would be slightly lower because it would be us paying a 2015 base rather than in, let's say, 2019, it would be in 2020. So it does, because to your point, we still pay our annual required unfunded liability payments in addition to our normal costs, and those payments alone are derived to make sure that over time we're paying down the unfunded liability. The ADPs are this council's proactive measure to try and do more and continue to pay down an additional amount of unfunded liability as opposed to just the annual derived payments from CalPERS.
And a second question, if I could, Mayor, which is a little bit different direction. This new information seems very different, and I'm wondering if we shouldn't go back to the Finance Committee to discuss our investment policy or strategy. Does that make sense to staff?
So in the memo, staff highlighted that based on this methodology, we already had direction to go back to the Finance Committee from this committee, but this methodology might make it a relatively simple conversation that if we are going to continue to do ADPs, you should only do one per year based on this methodology.
But if I could follow on a little bit, we could instead be gaining market exposures by using instead of the PARS account, the PERS account that we're set up. And we may decide instead of using the low gain one, we want to use the high gain one. That seems like it might be part of the discussion now in order to gain back some of that multiple market exposure. Is that a reasonable thought?
So the CEPPT Trust Strategy 2 that this committee adopted last time is a slightly different asset allocation, so it would be a different exposure. It is an asset allocation that is targeted at about the 5% return rate, whereas the PERF fund that we're discussing now, the CalPERS main fund, targets a 7% rate. So part of, I think, the discussion with the Finance Committee for future ADPs would be where is the right place for them to be domiciled. If you think the markets are extremely volatile, then maybe the operating portfolio of the town is the better place to domicile it. If you think the markets aren't that volatile, then the CEPPT would be the right place to domicile it until we make the actual payment directly to CalPERS. So I would say you're right, it is a different exposure also.
Okay, I do actually want to bring the council back to the question that's before us this evening, which is the staff recommendation to delay the payment. If there's any kind of motion on that matter, if the person making the motion thinks it's appropriate to provide direction for future discussion at Finance Committee, that's of course appropriate, but I'd like us to focus our discussion on tonight's recommendation. With that, are there any other questions? Ms. Spector.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Andrews, can you verbalize to us any potential negative ramification of following the staff recommendation?
Thank you, Vice Mayor. I suppose if between now and June 30th, if the market were to have a significant increase, we will have missed an opportunity to not only receive the budgetary benefit of giving the additional payment, but perhaps if the market did finish up 7%, we will have achieved, if CalPERS fund had met its 7% return, we will have missed that opportunity. So I think from a staff perspective, the probability associated with a significant market upturn is probably slightly less with only 2 months left and kind of what we've observed in the markets and that's why the recommendation is to delay. But that would be the downside, is if the market were to have a significant upturn in the next 2 months.
Would another potential negativity be if the market is worse in the next fiscal year than it is right now?
I actually think, and it's kind of contrary to talk about a down market in a positive light, but if we were to delay the payment into the next fiscal year, and as the year progressed, if it was lower, it means it was still lower than the current fiscal year. And so even though we will potentially have an ADP associated with a negative investment return, it will still be at a lower funding level than the current one. It would be similar to if we were to buy a stock at $30 and it went down to $20 and we bought more, and then it went down to 10, well, we still end up with losses on both of those, but instead of our entry price being 30, our average entry price is now 25. And so in essence, we will have given ourselves a better entry price, which with long-term investors is an appropriate action, but it doesn't negate the fact that we had losses in both years.
All right, and I too wish this had gone to the Finance Committee, but that's not where it is right now. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to assume that that's the conclusion of the questions. Am I correct about that? Seeing no hands going up, I'm going to ask the council for a motion. And if I see none, I'll make one myself. Okay, I'm going to make a motion that we accept staff's recommendation to provide modified direction to not make the payment as currently scheduled to CalPERS prior to May 1st, 2020, but to delay that until after July 1, 2020, for the reasons that have been stated by Mr. Andrews, which I'll summarize in my motion, that being that following the recommendation gives us a different market exposure, and that though we don't know what the market conditions will be next year, we are reasonably certain that the market conditions are poor this year, and we will not have a differentiation for our asset allocations. I will add to that motion that the Finance Committee agenda, when it next meets, considers this question, and the question Mr. Andrews raised as to whether or not payments should be made every year, given the CalPERS direction, and also the questions Mr. Rennie raised about the appropriate home, if you will, for town assets. And is there any second to that motion? I see a second from Mr. Rennie. All right, discussion on the motion. Raise your hand if you'd like to discuss it. If not, I'm going to call the question. Again, a roll call. Vice Mayor?
Yes.
Councilwoman Seok?
Yes.
Councilman Rennie?
Yes?
And the mayor votes yes. It passes unanimously. Thank you all. That's the last item we have on this meeting, so I'm going to adjourn. Please log out of this meeting, log back into the regular council meeting at the appropriate time. But thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Andrews.